We're now going to start our last topic, that is the setting of prices using auctions. Obviously, the first question to ask is, why would we want to use an auction to determine a price? Most of the models that we've looked at in this course are ones in which firms have simply set a price and buyers can take it or leave it. But sometimes a posted price doesn't work because the seller has to know what price to post. In the past, what we've been assuming is that the seller knows demand for the product, the seller knows buyer's maximum willingness to pay, and is able to figure out, based on that information about the demand curve, what the profit maximizing price would be. Or, in the most extreme case, the seller could carry out perfect price discrimination. But suppose that the seller simply doesn't know anything or simply doesn't know enough about demand. In that case, we need the buyers to help us figure out what the value is. Because after all, the buyers know their own valuations. And in this case, the seller doesn't know. Or perhaps the seller doesn't have as good knowledge about the nature of or the quality of what's being sold. Maybe the buyers are the ones who are the specialists there. And so we need them to compete against each other to determine what the price is going to be. Well, there are many different kinds of auctions, so let's just run through some of the basic terminology. We can classify auctions depending on the nature of the bids. So if everybody is bidding openly and publicly so that other participants in the auction can see what the bids are, we call that an open bid auction. That's sometimes interesting for the participants because you can see what other people are doing, and that reveals something about their valuations for whatever it is that's being sold. On the other hand, instead of bids being public, bids could be private. They could be taking place in what's called a closed or sealed bid auction. So you can imagine, for example, the participants in the auction writing down their bids, and in the case of a sealed bid auction, you can imagine them putting their bids in an envelope and keeping them secret. Another way that we can classify auctions is based on the price that the winner pays. Now, at first glance, this may seem a little bit strange. You might think, well, obviously the winner is the person who makes the highest bid. But it's not quite so simple. There are auctions which are called second price auctions. That is, auctions in which the price that the winner pays is essentially the second highest bid, usually increased by some small amount. We'll see some examples. Well, let's think of some other types of auctions. Auctions differ depending on how much time is available for them. One common type of auction is an open-ended auction. So as long as people are making bids, as long as the price is going up and up, the auction will continue. But there are plenty of examples in which the auction ends at a specified time, and all the bids have to be received before that time. So, for example, a sealed bid auction is an auction like that. So all the bids have to be received by a certain date, a certain time, and the bids are then compared and a decision is reached as to who has won. If any of you have ever participated in eBay auctions, you'll know that those are auctions that end at a specified time. You can also classify the auction by the nature of what is being auctioned. A common type of auction is what's called a private value auction. That is, the bidders, the participants in the auction, have their own private valuations, their own private willingness to pay for the object. Imagine, for example, that a rare manuscript by a famous writer is being sold. Well, different people would have different amounts that they would be willing to pay for that. This is in contrast to what's called a common value auction. So a common value auction is different from a private value auction because the participants are thinking about what the future market price is going to be for what's being sold. So, for example, if we went to a cattle auction, the people buying the cattle would have to think about the price that they would be able to get in the future when they sold those cattle, say for slaughter. Well, let's look at one particular kind of auction, a common one, called the English auction. So this is an auction that's called an ascending price auction. So in other words, the bids, each subsequent bid is higher than the bid before it. And it's also an open auction so that people can see what the bids are. So in an ascending price auction, a new bid is only accepted if it's higher than an old bid. And the highest bid is going to win. Now, a little bit more terminology for us. We can describe each buyer as having what's called a reservation price. That's what we've been calling their maximum willingness to pay. And they're not going to bid anything more than that. That wouldn't make any sense. Sellers, on the other hand, can set a reserve price. The idea of a reserve price is that the seller thinks that the item that's being sold is worth at least a certain amount, and they would not be willing to accept anything less than that. The English auction is flexible in terms of its timing. It could be open-ended, which is probably what many of you are familiar with, but it could also take place for a fixed length of time, as in the eBay example that I gave. Let's just look at an example of a private value English auction, hypothetical case, and let's suppose that we have what are called bid increments. So typically in the case of items that have very high value, nobody's going to be interested in wasting their time with very low bid increments. So in other words, if somebody bids $100 million for this painting, nobody is going to be allowed to say, $1,010,010. That's not worth their time. So let's suppose that we've got increments of $1 million. What's the outcome of this auction going to be? Well, let's suppose, given these reservation prices, or maximum willingness to pay on the part of these different individuals, of course only they know those particular values, the bidding is going to take place. Well, you can see that clearly only two people are in the running here who have the highest valuations. And suppose that the bidding went on and Ms. Eras bid $119 million. Then we know that Mr. Moneybags here will bid $120 million, and he will win the auction. So obviously he's going to get some consumer surplus. His reservation price, or his willingness to pay, was higher than the actual price that he had to pay. Another way to think about this is that the price that he paid is really the second highest valuation, Ms. Eras' valuation, plus an increment. In this case, an increment of $1 million. So this is really what is called the second price auction. So for example, Mr. Moneybags had a reservation price of $150 million, then he would get a much bigger consumer surplus. But he wouldn't have to bid up to the maximum amount that he'd be willing to pay. Well, what can we conclude about this? Oh, I should just add, this is an actual example. This painting, called The Scream, exists in, I think, at least 3 different versions, painted by the same artist. This version here was sold for $120 million in 2012. The auction itself lasted for 12 minutes. Okay, our conclusions about the English auction. The final price, as we've seen, is really the reservation price of the second highest bidder, because that's how high that second highest bidder is willing to bid, plus some bidding increment. So the person who's going to win the auction is going to have to just outbid the person with the second highest valuation. And as we saw in that example, the buyer can get some surplus. In principle, the amount of that surplus is going to depend on the number of bidders. So the more bidders there are, the more likely it is that their reservation prices are going to be closer to each other. So that's why if you want to have an auction, you want to have as many people participating as possible. That's going to reduce the surplus that the buyer is going to get, and is going to leave a price that's closer to the highest reservation price amongst all the bidders. So what should bidders' strategy be in this particular case? Well, it makes sense to bid up to your reservation price, and of course not beyond that. Let's consider one more kind of auction. This is called a second price sealed bid auction. And as I've noted here, sometimes called a Vickrey auction, after William Vickrey. Incidentally, he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 1996 and had the bad luck of having a heart attack about a week later. He died. Well, Vickrey wrote a famous paper analyzing this particular type of auction. So let's look at it in a bit more detail. In this case, because it's a sealed bid auction, the bids are not open, they're private. And the person who makes the highest bid wins, but pays the second highest bid, again, plus some small increment. So in that respect, it very much looks like an English auction, except that the bids are private. So the best strategy, if you have to participate in such an auction, is just to bid your reservation price. And if your reservation price, or if your willingness to pay, is the highest amongst everyone participating, then you're going to win the auction. So this kind of auction can be used for both a private value and a common value auction. Now, I just note here on the slide that if it's a common value auction, this is going to reduce the danger of what's called a winner's curse. I'll explain that shortly, but that's the idea that you've overestimated the value of what's being sold. You've overestimated its future market value, and in that case, you're running the risk of paying too much. So in this case, the price that you end up paying is the valuation that the second highest bidder places upon it. So that reduces the danger of you paying too much. Well, let's just have a quick example of this kind of auction. I found this example here. It's an auction of a rare stamp. So there's a company that specializes in stamp auctions. And here they describe how they set the prices. So bids are private, and the person, as we saw with the highest bid, is going to win. And they have a simple pricing rule. So the highest bidder pays a price that's equal to the price of the second highest bid plus one increment. Or if there's a minimum bid, which would really be the case where there's a reservation price, then you pay the increment above that reservation price, or what here is called a minimum bid. So from their catalog, they give the example of if the high bid is $200 and the second highest bid is $100, then the person with the high bid of $200 pays $100 plus a $5 increment. And typically the increments vary depending on the general value of the item, as I described in the case of the auction of the painting. Okay, well, we're now going to turn to examine common value auctions in some detail.